Hello, everyone. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Dries Bostyn. He's a social psychologist, statistician, and philosopher currently doing a BOF senior postdoctoral fellowship at the Social Psychology Lab at Ghent University. His primary research focus is the study of moral psychology, and today we're going to talk mostly about trolley-type moral dilemmas, sacrificial dilemmas, moral cognition, and some other related topics. So, Dr. Bostyn, welcome to the show. It's a huge pleasure to have you on.
Thank you for having me. Looking forward to our chat.
So, just to introduce the topic for people who might not be familiar with what we're going to talk about here, what are trolley-type moral dilemmas?
So there's not one official definition for the trolley-type dilemmas, of course. But I would say there are a class of moral dilemmas that the most well-known example of them is the trolley dilemma, which is a well-known moral dilemma, possibly maybe even the most well-known dilemma.
Yeah.
And so I usually always start just by giving people the example, even though by now many people are so familiar with it. But just to kind of ground the discussion of what we're talking about. So the trolley dilemma is basically a moral dilemma that depicts a scene where a runaway trolley train is about to run over 5 people. Sometimes these are 5 people that are tied to the tracks. Sometimes they're just unsuspecting workmen. But in any case, the train is going to run over 5 people. And the moral dilemma poses a question. Imagine that you could avert this disaster. Usually there are multiple ways in which this can be done. The most classic way is, imagine you can avert this disaster by diverting the train to a secondary track, which would be great, but then unfortunately there's one other person on the track, and so then the moral dilemma emerges: should you sacrifice one person to save the 5? And the core idea behind these dilemmas is just that they contrast a desire to minimize harm, to strive towards the greater good, with a sort of refusal, a sort of disavowalment of actively harming others. Sometimes that's framed in terms of norms or rules versus and principles versus consequences. Sometimes people say this is about deontology versus utilitarianism, but I prefer just kind of keeping it as low level as possible and just saying it's about do you want to actively harm, like, are you okay with actively harming others to pursue a greater good? I would say that is what trolley-type dilemmas are all about. Why trolley-type? I guess because trolleys are the quintessential example. There's many variations within the trolley dilemmas, but there's also many other dilemmas that have like this same basic shape, this same basic structure, that do not involve trolley trains whatsoever. Hence why it's a class of moral dilemmas. Yeah.
So, please correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that one of the goals with studying or doing studies where we expose people to trolley-type moral dilemmas and see how they respond to them is to try to understand whether people prefer the ontological or a consequentialist approach to them. So, what do people tend to prefer? Do we know that?
It really depends on what specific dilemma that you give them. So there are some dilemmas, the classic trolley dilemma, where you just have to divert the trolley train to a secondary track. There, like 80% of people will prefer the so-called utilitarian response, the response that corresponds with sacrificing one person for the greater good.
Okay.
There's some debate on whether we should really label these specific responses as utilitarian or deontological. You're certainly correct in that the classic traditional way of looking at these dilemmas and looking at these responses is to sort of see them as proxies of these underlying philosophical ideas, and that it's about contrasting deontological versus utilitarian. But it's very easy to switch people's opinion on these dilemmas. Like the much of the theorizing in this field started with the observation that if you give people the classic trolley dilemma, they prefer the utilitarian response. But if you change it a little bit around. If you ask people about a variation of a trolley dilemma, the footbridge dilemma, where it's not about diverting the trolley train to another track, but where you have to stop the trolley by pushing a large stranger in front of the train and using their considerable mass, then people tend to refer the deontological response. So it really depends on the type of dilemma that you give them. That having said, there is a consistency across dilemmas, though. So people, there are a certain set of personality differences that sort of help determine what response that people prefer in general. And so you could say that there are some people that are consistently more likely to prefer the so-called utilitarian choice, and there are people that are consistently more likely to prefer the so-called deontological choice. Yeah.
But in one of your studies, you found out that when confronted with a trolley problem, people conform to deontological but no consequentialist majorities. Could you explain that?
Yeah. So what we did in that study was we confronted people with a series of these dilemmas. Not all trolley dilemmas. Some of them were the same basic structure but different content. And then we told people like, hey, the majority of people prefer this option, or the majority of people prefer that option. And what we found there is that indeed people were more likely to shift their responses in the direction of the deontological response of not harming, of not committing the sacrificial harm, of not harming the single person to save the five, versus the other way around. The way that we interpret that effect is that I mean, moral judgment is to some extent about judging behavior, about judging actions, but it's also about judging people. And when we make a moral judgment, obviously we will usually try and pursue the course of action that we think is best, but we do take into account what other people might think about that as well, obviously. And the moral judgments that we make, they are in a way also they serve a communicative purpose as well. And there's been some research, and I'm sure we might talk about this later as well, that has suggested that in general, people tend to prefer deontologists over utilitarians. And the way that we interpret our results is that people strategically shift their responses towards the deontological side because it's the more socially safe side to pursue. It's a little bit more risky. People might distrust you a little bit more if you make utilitarian judgment, and that is why we found a larger conformity effect in the deontological direction versus the utilitarian direction. Yeah.
I mean, let me ask you this. With these kinds of studies, are you interested in, or is it possible to tell whether people would be in a sort of innate way predisposed toward deontology or toward consequentialism? I mean, is that something that you're interested in exploring? And is that something that these studies can tell us or not?
Do you mean like personality wise, other people with like more of a utilitarian personality, people with
I mean, if in terms, of course, these are probably not the best terms to use, but if in terms of our human nature, we tend to be more predisposed toward preferring deontology or consequentialism.
I think there certainly have been people that have been trying to show one way or the other. I myself would be a little bit hesitant to say that the type of studies that we're doing would be able to answer that kind of question, because mainly the amount of variety that I see in how people respond to these dilemmas and how quickly people shift from one option to the other. I find it's very hard to make a kind of general statement like people overall prefer deontology, people overall prefer utilitarians. I think a lot of the dilemmas that we have been using in the field are also a very specific set of dilemmas, and we haven't explored a sufficiently broad set of dilemmas just yet to be able to really provide a good answer to that question.
Yeah, no, that's fair enough. I just wanted to know if this was
Yeah.
something that these kinds of studies could answer or not. So you have done experiments on people where they had to decide whether to allow two confederates to receive a painful electroshock or shock a third confederate. I mean, this is also a trolley type kind of problem. Which results did you get, and what motivations did people provide for their choice?
Yeah. So this is somewhat have been my most recent focus.
Yeah.
Actually, that paper just got accepted and will be upcoming pretty soon.
Oh.
So very timely question. But yeah, so the main idea of that study was we're doing all of this research on trolley-type dilemmas, and for like very obvious reasons. We can't go hire trains to run over people. Like that would not be a fairly ethical way to conduct research. Um, and so a lot of the research that we have been doing in moral psychology is just asking people to reflect on these moral dilemmas.
Mhm.
But there's a little bit of a asking someone to reflect on a dilemma or having them actually respond to a dilemma with real consequences. Um, the two things are not fully the same, psychologically speaking. And so I have been looking for ways to create sort of trolley type dilemmas within the lab and confront people with an actual consequential real dilemma and see like how do they behave. And so that was the main idea behind that study. And the way we did that is like you described. I invited participants to a lab, and then I had three confederates there, three targets, all of which were hooked up to electroshock machines. And I would tell my participants, hey, um, we're going to do a moral dilemma today. Two of these people are going to get a shock unless you decide to shock the single person instead. Um, the results that we found, I thought they were quite interesting. There's many different angles that we can look at. But as you pointed out, one of the things that we also did is we had people make these decisions, and then we asked them, why did you make these decisions? And the motivations that people gave for those decisions, I thought were quite interesting. And so just to give like a sort of general summary of what we found there is that when people made the so-called utilitarian choice, when they decided to shock the single person to save the two others, in almost all cases, they did motivate that with a sort of cost-benefit analysis. They just said that, well, I mean, if people are going to get hurt, I'm going to pursue the greater good. It's better if only one person gets hurt versus two. What is interesting is how people motivated their choices when they didn't decide to do that. There, we actually found what I feel is a great variety of motivations. There were some people that, and I wasn't really expecting this ahead of time, that sort of said, I did not want to hurt the single person because that person was sitting alone, and at least the two people, they have each other. Shared harm is better than having to suffer alone. Now, just to be clear, like everyone was sitting in one room. Like it was not like the one person was separated from the two others. They were like everyone was sitting like a meter apart. But still, like a lot of people were like, oh, I didn't want to. The single person was already sort of punished because they were sitting alone. So that was a motivation that occurred quite often. Some participants said, well, I didn't feel like it was my responsibility to make this decision. The sort of universe and fate had already decided that these two people were going to get shocked, and who am I to interfere and interject my own moral opinion in this sort of situation? Did it have a group of people, which I would say corresponds a little bit more with like the classic way that we're thinking about these dilemmas, that did actually say, like, I did not want to actively harm others. I didn't want to, I thought it was bad. I thought everyone had an equal right not to receive a shock. And so what right do I have to like sacrifice an innocent person? And then you also had people that just expressed like and it might appear a little bit silly, but I don't think it's that silly. A preference for like a specific person, like oh, that person was smiling at me, so I didn't want to shock them. With this, obviously from like a philosophical perspective, might not be the best argumentation for that type of judgment. To me, it sort of corresponds with, and maybe this is a little bit far-fetched, but almost like this moral desert type of thinking. I feel like that person didn't deserve to be shocked. And so one of the takeaways that we have from that study is that we tend to see these, to look at the judgments that people make as just like it's deontological versus utilitarian. But I struggle to, you could obviously argue that what we're seeing in the deontological case is that the various types of motivations that we're uncovering there, that's sort of a post hoc reasoning that people are doing to sort of, they don't want to commit to that judgment, and so they grasp onto every possible explanation that they can. And that is like we can't prove that with the studies that we've done so far, that these are actual things that have influenced people's moral judgments. But if you're willing to sort of assume that, hey, maybe this is actually going, maybe people are being sincere, and maybe there are these different types of motivations driving these judgments, then all of a sudden there appears to be all of these layers that I feel have previously gone unexplored. And I think we can actually make a good case that that is what is actually going on, because a lot of the things that we're seeing, we are seeing in other types of moral judgments that people make when, for instance, the no responsibility type of judgment. People that say, oh, I don't want to get engaged, this is not my responsibility. We make those judgments all the time. Like if you're walking down the street and you see a homeless person, that is a sort of moral dilemma that you're encountering then. But and in many cases, people will decide actively, this is not my responsibility. This is not my moral responsibility to solve. And I think that some of what we're seeing in this real life sacrificial dilemma is exactly that. And so one of the things that we certainly want to try and do in the future is disentangle that a little bit more, and see if we can really see, are there different types of psychological processes underlying these types of judgments versus just deontological versus utilitarian.
I mean, that no responsibility approach that people might have, I find it very interesting because, I mean, from the perspective of moral philosophy or ethics, where instead of just trying to describe how people react or respond to these kinds of problems or moral dilemmas, where we're trying to establish what is the most moral way to conduct ourselves, whether it is to divert the trolley toward the other track and kill one person or just let the other people die. I mean, when people say that they don't want to just interfere, do anything because they're not responsible for what's happening, wouldn't that be a philosophically valid approach as well? Because I mean, I'm just thinking that if you find yourself in a situation where a trolley is coming down the track, I mean, it's not you causing that. And if you do something, whatever happens, then it's your fault, right? So, I mean, as a philosopher, because you're also a philosopher, what do you think about that? Do you think that's a valid ethical approach as well?
I mean, I would say it is. I think. I mean, I gave the example of the homeless person, right? We can't decide with any moral dilemma situation. We can't engage with any possible moral dilemma situation out there. There's plenty of moral dilemmas and horribly immoral things going on all over the world that we're actively choosing not to engage with. And so we have to make those judgments in some way. And so I think it's a valid philosophical position to take. I also think it's a psychologically necessary thing that we need to do. But it's also something that I feel we haven't fully taken into account when it comes to studying how people approach moral dilemmas. Because if we present people with a hypothetical moral dilemma, we're sort of assuming that they've already engaged with the situation, right? We've sort of you won't have. I mean, some people will say like it's not my. If you confront them with a trolley dilemma, a lot of people will say, "Oh, yeah, I don't want to get like sued, or I don't want to get like I don't want to murder someone," and then So there's some of that there, but I don't think we fully reckoned with the possible difference between people refusing to engage with a moral dilemma versus people actively deciding, I don't want to harm someone. I think there's a difference there that we need to explore further. Yeah.
No, yeah, that's very interesting. So let me ask you now about sacrificial dilemmas and then some of the principles associated with them. So, but first of all, what is a sacrificial dilemma?
So the sacrificial dilemma, it's sort of I tend to use it as a similar term as trolley-type dilemma. I think
Oh, okay.
Early in my career, I think I used to call things trolley-type dilemmas, and then eventually I think the field was still sort of figuring out how do we call this broader class of dilemmas, and then we eventually settled on sacrificial because it's that is in a way the core problem that is underlying these dilemmas. The problem of sacrificial harm is appropriate to actively harm to pursue a sort of greater good. So I would say they're trolley-type and sacrificial. You can use those in the same way.
Okay, fine. But tell us then about the action principle, the contact principle, and the intention principle, and how they play out in sacrificial or trolley-type dilemmas.
I mean, so there's a lot of variations that you can make in trolley dilemmas, and I guess the action, like these three principles that you're calling out, they're big ones. They have been studied quite a lot. And the core idea from the action principle, for instance, is that people tend to, if you tend to think it's worse to actively cause harm than to cause harm by omitting an action. It's maybe a little bit of an over-the-top example, but it's worse to push someone into a river, causing them to drown, than to, if you see someone drowning, not save them. So committing a harm by action is worse than committing a harm by inaction. Similarly, if you intend a harmful outcome, that is considered to be worse than if the harmful outcome is the result of a sort of a by effect, like it's collateral damage. You did not necessarily intend to the harm, but it is a side effect. And the contact principle is just people tend to think harm is worse when the harm that you commit is up close and personal, is direct, if it requires physical contact versus if it's a little bit more indirect. And those three differences, so those three principles, have been studied a lot through sacrificial dilemmas, and depending on like which side of the principle that you're on, you can push people's preferred response around a little bit.
And what are iterative sacrificial dilemmas, and how do they work, and what kinds of results do you get there?
Yeah, so the core idea behind iterative dilemmas is that when we give people moral dilemmas in a typical experiment, those moral dilemmas, they're always sort of isolated. They're always sort of within their own little universe. People give one response, and then there's nothing that happens after. There's nothing that comes before. They're abstracted from time and space. And if you think about that, that's actually very different from how moral dilemma situations are in real life. In real life, there is a prior history. There is a future history. There's never only one thing that you can do. You can react, and then you can, see the outcome, and you can possibly react again. And what we've done is essentially we confronted participants with a series of sacrificial dilemma, and essentially it was always the same dilemma with the same targets, the same victims, the same people involved. And we were just interested, like, is that going to change how people respond to these dilemmas? And just like as a classic example, or as an easy example, in that electroshock study that we did, that also included an iterative element. So participants entered the room, they were asked, okay, so the two people are going to get shocked. Do you want to shock the single person? And then they decided. Some people got shocked. And they did not notice ahead of time. We asked them, we basically said, okay, we're going to do that same dilemma. Again, the same two people are going to get shocked. And you can decide, once again, to shock the third person instead. Now, even though that is in a way exactly the same dilemma situation, right? It's the same people sitting there. It's the same type of shock. It's the same type of, do you want to harm one person to save two others, to pursue a greater good? Because we've repeated the dilemma, the underlying moral conflict has shifted. All of a sudden, it's not only about do you want to minimize harm? It's also about how do you want to balance harm? How do you want to pursue a fair outcome, or do you want to pursue an outcome that leads to the greatest good? And so what we see is that, and maybe this isn't too surprising, but in a way it is quite surprising, is that people do really shift their responses quite heavily. In I think the electroshock study, we did it twice, and in the first time we did it, I think 35% of people switched their response. I think in the second time we did it, it was a little bit lower, maybe 25% of people shifted their response in the direction of just switch their response. And if you then ask people, like, why did you do it? All of a sudden, you see this new type of motivation emerge, a motivation that wasn't present when you asked them about their motivations for the first decision. And that is this idea of, oh, I actually wanted to pursue a fair outcome. I wanted to give everyone one single shock, and so that's why I switched. I think that's important because it's something that we've also been neglecting in the way that we've been studying moral dilemmas. We've sort of been thinking about moral dilemmas as though every decision is independent from another decision, but that's not how morality works at all. Every moral decision is dependent on decisions that come before it and decisions that come after it. And so if we truly want to understand moral cognition, then we have to also start to investigate that dependency across decisions. And so that's kind of the idea that we've about these iterative dilemmas.
What is the dual process model for moral cognition, and how does it work?
So the dual process model for moral cognition, I think we're almost approaching an anniversary for the model by now. I think that it was originally formulated in 2001 by Joshua Green and his colleagues. Essentially, the dual process model posits that it's sort of a classic dual process model. It's intuition versus deliberation. And it links intuition and deliberation to two types of responses when it comes to sacrificial dilemmas. And essentially, it says, when you confront people with a sacrificial dilemma, if you give them some time to deliberate, if they're motivated, if they have a high motivation, and if they're not too emotionally impacted, that will lead to a higher likelihood of a utilitarian decision, of a decision that weighs the costs and benefits. That is sort of what the deliberative process is doing. It's weighing costs and benefits. It's looking at outcomes. Whereas it could also be the case, for instance, in the footbridge dilemma, you have to push someone in front of the train. That is a very, emotionally impactful thing to have to do. And so people, like, all of these emotional alarm bells are ringing, and then people are like, oh, I don't even care about the outcomes anymore. And that is what causes a deontological decision. So it's sort of like this idea that cognition will lead to utilitarian decisions, and emotion, intuition drives this sort of valuation of the action itself, this disavowal of harm. Yeah.
I mean, is there a relationship between cognitive ability and consequentialist judgment? I mean, is it that people with higher cognitive ability tend to favor consequentialism, or is there no relationship at all there?
So there are studies suggesting both that it is, and some studies that suggest that it's not the case. I think in general, I think most people in the field would say that there is an association. It might not be a super strong association between cognitive ability and condoning the sacrificial harm, responding in a utilitarian way in sacrificial dilemmas. We don't always tend to find it. I myself have been very unlucky. It seems in most of the studies that I've done, I don't really find this effect of either motivation or ability on the types of judgments that people make. So my personal opinion is that I do think there's something there. I think it's mostly going to be there in these types of dilemmas where there's a strong emotional response that has to be overcome. I'm a little bit more hesitant to say that if you were to look at all possible sacrificial dilemmas, you would still find that association. I think it's likely true for a subset of dilemmas. I don't think it's true for all dilemmas. For what it's worth, in the electroshock studies that we've been doing, I tend to find no effect whatsoever of short measures of ability or measures of motivation on the types of judgments that people prefer. I see no difference.
Mhm. And do we know if there are any other types of psychological traits that might predispose people toward preferring the ontology or consequentialism slash utilitarianism?
Yeah. So actually the one personality measure that I always seem to find has an effect is on the emotional side of things. It's for instance like something like primary psychopathy, measures of antisocial behavior, empathic concern. How easily are you affected by these horrible things that you might have to do in a dilemma? The less that you care about those, the more likely that you will be to condone the sacrificial harm. And I tend to find much stronger and consistent effects of those versus the deliberation measures.
Right. So in that case, people who have that kind of trait would prefer consequentialism. Is that?
Yeah. So the if you score higher on like measures of antisocial thinking, you will tend to prefer utilitarian side of things, which has also caused some debate in the field. Like, are we actually measuring utilitarianism, which is supposed to be this good thing worth pursuing, if we're finding that psychopaths tend to favor those types of judgments? And there's been some work on that. Some interesting work that also suggests that we should think about utilitarianism as having multiple facets. There's a dimension of this instrumental harm dimension. Are you okay with using others to pursue a greater good? But also this dimension of impartial beneficence. Are you okay with? Do you want to spread well-being to everyone, basically? And the people that make that decision, that split, tend to say like, oh, it's the instrumental harm part that corresponds with antisocial thinking versus the beneficial part.
Okay. So let me ask you now, because I know this is something that moral philosophers and experimental philosophers debate sometimes. Are trolley problems realistic? I mean, do they really tell us how people would behave in a real life situation?
I think there's a lot of layers to that question.
Okay.
One of the reasons why I'm trying to study these things in the lab is because I do genuinely think that there's a difference between being actually confronted with a dilemma and thinking about a dilemma in the abstract. If the question is like, are these dilemmas realistic? They're obviously not realistic. Like a lot of them are very unrealistic. The trolley dilemma itself is horribly unrealistic. And that having said, it's not because it's unrealistic that it might still trigger psychological processes within our mind that correspond to the processes that would be triggered in a real life similar situation. So I would say that the realism is something that we should worry about, and there's some very interesting research, for instance, showing that if you confront people with these trolley dilemmas, they do tend to be engaged. They do tend to like them. They like the psychological, intellectual exercise that they are. Some people find them very fun to do. And then you could wonder, well, is that actually like if you would encounter such a situation in real life, it would not be very fun at all. And so it is something that we, I think, do need to take into account. I think it's something that we have been neglecting a little bit too much as a field. We like these dilemmas. They're fun to think about, and I think that's why we've been using them so much. And they allow for a lot of types of experimentation as well, right? Like it's very easy to shift vignettes around a little bit and see, oh, what changed, what causes, what resulting change do we see in our moral cognition. But still, we should do more to try and ground our research a little bit more in reality. If you're actually going to compare, like, how do people think about it and what do they do in the lab? We've done some studies on this. A good while ago, we did a study where, sort of similar to the electroshock dilemma that I explained, but where I invited people to the lab, and I did not have people hooked up to electroshocks. I had cages of mice. So I had one cage of 5 mice, and I had another cage of 1 mouse, and I said, very similar setup. The 5 mice are going to get an electric shock, but you can decide to shock the single mouse instead. And then we had some participants think about that dilemma. They read the text-based vignette, and others were invited to the lab. And what we did find there was that people were actually more likely to commit the sacrificial harm, to shock the single mouse in the real life case versus the hypothetical case. So there does seem to be like a shift that happens. Like if you're comparing the two, then I would say there's some evidence. There's also similar evidence when you look at VR, virtual reality studies. People tend to prefer sacrificial harm more in a VR, virtual reality version of a dilemma, versus when they're just reading the text and thinking about it. And so there does seem to be something about making a dilemma more real that shifts responses towards the sacrificial harm side, the utilitarian side. And so that could be an argument to say that there's a difference here. On the other side of things, we have also looked at, if you ask people to respond to a bunch of trolley dilemmas, and then you see, do their responses predict what they actually do in real life? We do also find a little bit of an association there. So it's not like thinking about these dilemmas is completely different than being exposed to them in real life. The way that we think about them does predict what they do in real life as well. It's not a super strong correlation. I think across studies we have something like a correlation of, no, we have about 6% variation explained, which is not a tremendous amount, but then again, like it's psychology, right? So with 6% of variation explained, maybe we're already happy. I don't know. It depends on your perspective. So my personal opinion on the matter is that what we're doing in these hypothetical dilemmas is like obviously that is not completely. It relates to how people behave in real life. That having said, if you put people in a real life dilemma situation, all these sorts of other elements start to get pulled into the situation, and you can't fully replicate that in a hypothetical vignette study. One of the problems that so I did those mouse studies, and we tried to replicate those initial results, and actually that paper is also upcoming pretty soon. And just we made some minor changes in the way that we were administrating the dilemmas, and that already led to quite a shift in how people behaved. And it is really hard to sort of, if you have a hypothetical dilemma, just a text-based dilemma, to create a situation in real life that is fully comparable to that hypothetical dilemma. Just imagine, in the real life case, for instance, we typically work with a time limit. Let's say you have 20 seconds to react. You could implement a 20-second time limit when you confront participants with a hypothetical dilemma as well. But 20 seconds in the real life situation might not be comparable to 20 seconds in a hypothetical situation. Because in a hypothetical situation, there's all of these other sort of impulses coming at people. It's a much more emotionally impactful situation than just thinking about it. And so then all of a sudden you have to wonder, okay, so what would be a good comparison here? Like how many seconds do we need to use in in one instance versus the other, to be able to even compare these two dilemmas that are at the core, they're the same, but they're still very different experiences, right? And so if the answer is can we use these hypothetical dilemmas to study real life cognition, I think we can. But there's also real limits to what we can learn from these hypothetical dilemmas. And at some point, we as a field will need to actually put people in the lab and confront them consistently and systematically with real life dilemmas to see how people behave.
Mm-hmm. So another kind of aspect of sacrificial moral dilemmas you study or have studied is how people infer the moral character of others based on how they resolve these moral dilemmas. So what results do you get there? I mean, how do people tend to evaluate the moral character depending on how others respond to these dilemmas?
Yeah, we talked about it a little bit previously already, and indeed, like every moral judgment is also like it has a communicative purpose. Like if you hate if you disagree with the things that I disagree with, or if you agree with the things that I agree with, that will usually form a bond between people. What we tend to see in these sacrificial dilemmas, or what we used to see, I'll add a little bit of a nuance at the end there, is that if you confront people with a sacrificial dilemma, people will usually prefer others that make deontological judgments versus those that make utilitarian judgments. That basic effect has been, I think Professor Jim Everett was the first one, wrote the first paper about it, and it has been replicated a bunch of times. We've replicated it as well. I've found that result quite often. People tend to dislike utilitarians more than they like deontologists, tend to trust utilitarians less than they trust deontologists. That has a lot of downstream consequences. There's even some studies showing that, obviously in the abstract, but if you ask people who would you prefer as a mate, for instance, people will tend to favor deontologists versus utilitarians. There's a few wrinkles to that. In some cases, people do actually prefer utilitarians. If you need a sort of like a general, like a cold, ruthless leader, then you might actually prefer someone that is a bit more utilitarian and a bit more pragmatic in the types of moral judgments that they make than a deontologist. I think some of the reasons why we tend to find these judgments, I think, are related to what we've talked about previously as well, is that one of the reasons why someone might prefer utilitarian judgment is because they might just not care about the harm. If someone scores high on our antisocial measures, they prefer utilitarian judgments, and maybe some of what we're seeing is that people are making this utilitarian judgment, and we think, oh, this might be a genuine concern for the greater good, but it might also just be a psychopath, and that is why we sort of see this distrust emerge. It might also be related to there's some research suggesting that it's related to predictability. Someone that's a deontologist, someone that will always go like, oh, I don't want to harm anyone else, is a bit more predictable and might, because of that, be a little bit more preferable as a partner, as a cooperation partner, than a utilitarian, which is great when you're on the right side of the track, but if you're on the wrong side of the track, they might decide against you. But I will say some of the more recent research that we've been doing is because when a few years ago, I started doing this type of who do people prefer with iterative dilemmas, like in these sequences of decisions. Who do people prefer there? And there we consistently were finding that people actually liked utilitarians more than they liked deontologists, which was very strange and which went against an entire literature and initially confused us very much. And so what we hadn't been taken into account, and I think hasn't been taken into account in a lot of this research, is that I've already hinted at it, people tend to prefer similar orders. And within the field, a lot of the dilemmas that we have been using have been dilemmas that most people will prefer a deontological response to. And so some of the preference that we're seeing for utilitarians does not appear to be like on every type of sacrificial dilemma, people prefer deontologists over utilitarians. It really depends on the dilemma. And so we've done one study where in study one we found, oh, people prefer utilitarians, and in study two, oh, people prefer deontologists. And what seems to be going on is that a lot of the difference is just explained by similarity. People prefer the ones that have the same judgments as they do. Deontologists prefer deontologists, and utilitarians prefer utilitarians. And once you start controlling for that, the difference between trust versus utilitarians and trust versus deontologists, it sort of gets diminished a lot. I think in general, based on, because there is this huge literature that people prefer deontologists, I would still be tempted to say there likely is something there, but the effect is much more variable and much more vulnerable than if you had asked me this question 5 years ago, I would have been like, oh yeah, certainly people hate utilitarians. Now I'm like, it really depends on the type of moral dilemma that we're dealing with. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's very interesting. So I have one last question then. In a real life situation, people can also choose, and we've already touched a little bit on this, but I want to ask you directly.
Yeah.
So people can also choose to just exit the social dilemma. Do people do so? And if so, why?
It's also something that we haven't really been studying a lot. And you're right, like when people are confronted with a hypothetical dilemma, again, like engagement is assumed, right? And so we don't really allow people the possibility to exit the dilemma. I think it happens in real life. I think people decide to leave moral dilemma situations all the time, but it is hard to study. I guess one way of studying it would be in like sort of the lab studies that we have been doing. In those lab studies, we have encountered a few times, not a lot. I think by now I've exposed over 1,800 participants with like these types of real life lab dilemmas so far. And across the 1,800, I think maybe 10, 11, or 12, when they encounter the dilemma, were like, oh, I would rather not participate in this. I would like to exit this situation. It happened a bit more in the mouse dilemmas than it happens when in the electroshock dilemmas with people. And the main driver of that was always people that have this very high concern for animal welfare. There were a couple of people there that had pet mice themselves, and that just really could not participate. They were like this is potential animal abuse. I don't want to partake in this at all. And so that's it's in those cases it was like a really strong moral concern about the animals. Maybe I need to add though, like in those experiments, we didn't actually harm any animals. Like we just pretended that we were going to harm animals, and then as soon as some people made a decision, we just stopped the experiment. So no mice were harmed over the course of that experiment. But that was the main driver of people deciding to engage, to disengage from the situation. It's just a concern for animal welfare. I think in general, I think people might exit social dilemma situations for multiple reasons. I think one of the reasons might be they're just emotionally overwhelmed, and so they're just shutting down. I think another reason might also just be they're confronted with a bunch of options and they don't like any of them, and so as a sort of result of that, they rather than pick one of the options that they really don't want to pick, they just go, I don't want to deal with this at all. Or it might also be just people were never fully engaged with the situation at all. Sort of what we talked about previously with this no responsibility idea is that people are like, it's not my place to make a decision here, and that might cause people to sort of step back from the dilemma situation. I think it definitely happens. I also don't think that we have sufficient good data on it just yet, and I for one would definitely be interested in doing some more research in that direction. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so would you like to tell us what are the kinds of things you will be working on in the near future, and are they also related to these kinds of psychological and philosophical exploration of trolley-type moral dilemmas, or something else?
Yeah. My main focus for the future, though I will need to get some more grant money to actually get it going, will like I want to put people in labs and confront them with real life moral dilemmas. And I think the basic setup that we have right now with the electroshocks and shocking people it's a very rich setup already. There's a lot of things that you can tweak about that setup to see how it impacts people's moral judgments. So like just to give like one example, in in the studies that we've conducted so far, like the basic version is just you have three people sitting there and they are all men or all women. One manipulation that you could do is you could do, oh, it's two men versus one woman versus two men, and see to what extent does the gender characteristics of the victims, to what extent does that drive the types of judgments that people prefer. Or you could manipulate the way in which that harm needs to be done. In one version of the experiment, we separated the participants and the targets with a one-way mirror. So participants could see the targets, the confederates, but not vice versa. And in another version of the experiments, they were all located in the same room. And then if participants had to commit the sacrificial harm in the mirror version, they could do it in their room. They just had to press a button there. And in the one room version, participants had to walk up to the victim and actually touch them on the arm. And so it's a much more emotionally direct experience. And there's all these sorts of parameters that you can play with. You could give participants the option to shock themselves, for instance, and see when will people decide in favor of self-harm. You could tell participants something about the people that are sitting there. Like maybe someone is like a volunteer for a charity. To what extent are people going to weigh that? And I think it's a very rich setup that we can use to explore not just how people respond to sacrificial dilemmas, but how they respond to moral dilemmas in general. Because I feel we've talked about the dual process model, which is which has been a very influential and important model to sort of explain how do people respond to sacrificial dilemmas. But there's many different types of moral dilemmas out there, right? If you I don't know, if your coworker did something wrong and you have to like weigh, do I want to tell my boss yes or no? That is also a moral dilemma, but it's not really a sacrificial dilemma. And so we don't really have a good process theory for what goes on in the mind when people are confronted with a dilemma like that. And I think by confronting people in the lab with real dilemmas, we can work towards a more general sort of process model for how people cope with moral dilemmas. And I think we can start with the dual process model. But what some of our studies with these real-life dilemmas have already shown is that the dual process model cannot explain everything that's out there. The dual process model does not really explain why people, when you confront them with these types of iterative dilemmas, why they switch. It talks about not wanting to harm others. It talks about utilitarianism. It doesn't talk about when people go, actually, I don't want to just minimize harm. I want to spread harm fairly. That's sort of new moral concern that's emerging. And we don't know what drives people to stay with the utilitarian choice or what drives them towards the fairness choice. And so I think we have a core setup here that will allow for a lot of more variation in moral judgments to explore in a real life lab setting. And just by systematic manipulations, we will be able to create better models. Eventually, I would also like to just design other real-life moral dilemmas that we can study in the lab. I very much like this electroshock paradigm. I think there's a lot of things to be done there, but just in the way that trolley dilemmas are not realistic, like going into a lab and having to make decisions about who you want to shock is arguably also not really realistic. Like it's not a type of choice that people encounter a lot in their day-to-day. Again, I do think that we can use it to study some of the psychological processes that work in real-life conditions, but it's still a very artificial situation. And I would like to explore a wider variety of moral dilemma situations in the lab. And so that's essentially going to be my focus for the next couple of years. Try and get some money to do more of these studies and really explore the difference between what can thinking about these dilemmas, what can that teach us versus if you put people in these situations, how do they react? And that tension and the similarities and differences that emerge. That is really going to be my main research interest.
And where can people find your work on the internet?
So I am on Twitter still, or X, or whatever we call it nowadays. I should actually, I don't even know my username. I think Dries Bostyn. Well, probably if you just Google Dries Bostyn, I'm sure I have a personal website. It will emerge. I'm very easily findable on Scholar. People should not hesitate to reach out. I'm always happy to talk. I'm always happy to have a chat, especially about these sorts of things. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show. It's been a real pleasure to talk with you.
No, thank you very much for having me and for dealing with the little bit of the situation we had halfway through. No, it's been a very enjoyable conversation. Yeah.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you liked it, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights, learning and development done differently. Check their website at enlights.com, and also please consider supporting the show on Patreon or PayPal. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters: Per Ergo Larsen, Jerry Mullerens, Frederick Sunda, Bernardo Seixas, Olaf Alex, Adam Kessel, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Eric Alenia, John Connors, Philip Forrest Connolly, Dan Demetri, Robert Windiger, Rui Inácio, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Phil Kavanagh, Mikkel Stormir, Samuel André, Francis Fort, Tiago Nunes, Fergal Cossen, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Jonathan Librant, João Linhares, Stantantia, Samuel Correia, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, João Eira, Tom Hummel, Sardas France, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Romain Roach, Diego Londonho Correia, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavlo Stasevski, Nelek Bach, Guy Madison, Gary G. Alman, Sam Afzal, Adrian Yeager, Paul Tolentino, João Barbosa, Julian Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Douglas Fry, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Ponce Cortez, Ursula Litsky, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Sonny Smith, John Wiseman, Daniel Friedman, William Buckner, Paul George Arnaud, Luke Lowacki, Georgios Theophanos, Chris Williamson, Peter Wolozin, David Williams, Diogo Costa, Anton Erickson, Charles Murray, Alex Shaw, Maury Martinez, Coralie Chevalier, Bangalore Atheists, Larry Dealey Jr., Old Erringbon, Sterry, Michael Bailey, Dan Sperber, Robert Grassi, Igor N., Jeff McMahon, Jake Zool, Barnabas Radix, Mark Campbell, Thomas Dovner, Luke Nissen, Chris Story, Kimberly Johnson, Benjamin Galbert, Jessica Nowicki, Linda Brandon, Nicholas Carlson, Ismail Benzliman, George Coriatis, Valentin Steinman, Per Crowley, Kate Van Goller, Alexander Hubbard, Liam Dunaway, BR, Masood Ali Mohammadi, Perpendicular, Jonas Hertner, Ursula Goodenough, Gregory Hastings, David Pinsoff, Sean Nelson, Mike Lavigne, and Dios Necht. A special thanks to my producers: Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Tom Vanagdam, Bernard Ugni, Curtis Dixon, Benedict Mueller, Thomas Trumbull, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, Giancarlo Montenegro, Alnick Ortiz, and Nick Golden, and to my executive producers Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadriano, Bogdan Kanivets, and Rosie. Thank you for all.